Deep within the vivid valley of our imagination, every story blooms with intense color and deep emotional resonance. Experience a journey through the highs and lows of the human heart like never before. Hit subscribe today and wander through the beautiful landscape of our cinematic art.
Sign it before dessert, or my son will have the papers filed by morning. My mother-in-law's voice was pleasant, the way a razor is pleasant when it's still in its packaging. She set the document beside my wine glass with a smile that hadn't reached her eyes in the 6 years I'd known her. The dining room smelled of roasted lamb and white roses, and somewhere down the hall, 30 of the most prominent names in Connecticut were drinking champagne and celebrating my sister-in-law's engagement. Nobody had come to find us. Nobody would. My husband, Daniel, sat across from me. He was staring at the tablecloth. The document was a post-nuptial agreement. 22 pages. I had read every line while my mother-in-law, Margaret, excused herself to refresh her lipstick. The terms were precise and deliberately humiliating. In the event of divorce, I would walk away with nothing. No claim to the house in Greenwich we had shared for 4 years. No interest in my husband's family business. Not even reimbursement for the consulting work I had quietly done to keep that business from collapsing 3 winters ago. The signature line at the bottom had my name already typed beneath it. They had been very sure I would sign. I looked at my mother-in-law, then at my husband, then at my father-in-law, Gerald, who was standing near the door with his arms folded and the particular expression of a man who considers himself a fair witness to his own cruelty. I picked up the pen. Margaret exhaled. Gerald nodded once. Daniel finally looked up, relief already softening his jaw, and I understood in that moment that he had known about this before tonight. He had known and said nothing and driven me here in his silver car with the heated seats I had bought him for his birthday, and he had watched me walk into this room without a word of warning. I set the pen back down. No, I said. The word was quiet. It didn't need to be anything else. Before I tell you what happened when Gerald locked that dining room door and why a federal vehicle was parked on their circular driveway 40 minutes later, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been sitting at a table with people who share your last name? People who have eaten your cooking and accepted your gifts and smiled at you across church pews and felt more alone than you ever did as a stranger? Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know how far this one travels. Margaret's smile didn't falter. It never did. That was the thing about her. She had perfected the performance of graciousness so thoroughly that genuine warmth and calculated cruelty came out looking identical. She had been doing it since the first Sunday dinner she invited me to, 6 years ago, when she complimented my dress and then asked Daniel, loudly enough for me to hear from the kitchen, whether he had considered that he might be moving too quickly. Rachel, she said now, folding her hands on the table, we are not doing this to hurt you. We are doing this to protect Daniel's future. You came from very different circumstances. That isn't a judgment. It's simply a fact. My different circumstances, as Margaret framed them, were these. I had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Akron, Ohio. My mother worked nights at a hotel. My father had left when I was 9. I had put myself through Ohio State on scholarships and part-time work, and whatever grim determination gets handed down through women who have no other inheritance. I had moved to New York at 23 with $4,000 and a laptop and an idea I couldn't stop thinking about. What Margaret did not know, what no one at that table knew, was what I had built with that idea. You're not protecting Daniel, I said. You're protecting the image of what you think he deserves. Gerald stepped away from the door. You've been a lovely addition to this family, Rachel. But lovely isn't a business plan. He spoke the way men like him always speak, slowly, as if the slowness itself were a form of authority. Daniel's grandfather built something real here. We have obligations to that legacy that go beyond sentiment. The Harlow Group, that was the legacy Gerald was referencing. An old-money real estate and private equity firm, 3rd generation, with a portfolio that had been quietly hemorrhaging for a decade. I knew the exact figures. I knew them because 8 months ago, a holding company called Meridian Capital had acquired a controlling interest in 4 of the Harlow Group's most distressed assets. Gerald had accepted the deal gratefully, shaking hands with Meridian's representative, a very competent man named David, who worked for me. I did not say any of this. I'm not signing, I said again, and I'd like to go back to the party. Margaret's pleasantness finally showed its seams. Rachel. The warmth was gone. What was underneath it was older and colder and very certain of itself. You are a graphic designer who freelances for boutique agencies. You have no savings of consequence, no family money, and no career trajectory that warrants this level of resistance. What exactly do you think you're protecting? What I was protecting was mine, and I had built it over 7 years of 16-hour days and missed holidays in a specific, ferocious belief that the idea in my head was worth more than anyone around me could see. Meridian Capital was not a graphic design firm. It was a private investment vehicle through which I had quietly accumulated a portfolio of distressed media properties, undervalued tech startups, and strategic real estate that had grown, as of last quarter, to a valuation just over $900 million. I still freelanced. I liked the work. It kept me grounded and gave me excellent cover. None of this was Daniel's. I had been careful about that. Everything I built before our marriage was structurally separate, held in entities with names that didn't connect to mine in any public record. I was not hiding it from him out of malice. I was hiding it the way anyone hides something precious from people who have demonstrated they cannot be trusted with precious things. I had been waiting to see who he really was. Tonight, watching him stare at that tablecloth, I had my answer. I want to go back to the party, I said, standing. Gerald moved to the door. Not aggressively, just enough to make it clear he was in the way. We'd like to resolve this tonight, Rachel, before things become more complicated. More complicated? How? It was Daniel who spoke. He wouldn't look at me directly, which told me everything I needed to know about what he was about to say. Mom found something, he said, about the Whitfield account. I was still. The Whitfield account was a freelance project I completed 2 years ago. A branding package for a small hospitality group. I'd billed them $40,000, which was a legitimate rate for the scope of work. It was also, technically, processed through a subsidiary of Meridian. There was nothing illegal about it, but to someone without context, someone who had been specifically looking for ammunition, it could be made to look like undisclosed income, like hiding money from a spouse. Margaret opened a folder on the sideboard. We had a forensic accountant look at your financial activity over the last 3 years, she said, with the practiced calm of someone who has rehearsed this moment. There are significant discrepancies between the income you've reported to Daniel and what appears to be moving through accounts connected to your business activity. That's marital fraud, Rachel. In this state, that changes everything about how assets are divided. I looked at the folder, then at my husband. You hired someone to investigate me. He finally met my eyes. I needed to know the truth. There it was. The real architecture of the evening. The post-nuptial agreement wasn't the trap. It was the door they expected me to run toward when the real trap closed. They had manufactured a legal threat, something just credible enough to frighten someone without resources, and they were betting I would sign the agreement to make it go away. If I signed, I gave up any claim to marital assets. If I didn't sign, they threatened me with a fraud accusation that would be expensive and exhausting to fight even if I won. They thought they were being clever. They had no idea they had just put every card on the table in a game they didn't know they were losing. I sat back down. I reached into my bag. I set a small device on the table between us, matte black, the size of a thumb drive. Margaret looked at it uncertainly. Gerald frowned. What is that? Daniel asked. Insurance, I said. Let me go back, because I want you to understand something about the woman sitting at that table. I want you to understand who Margaret thought she was dealing with, and who she was actually dealing with, because the distance between those two things is the whole story. 2 years into my marriage, Daniel's family threw a 4th of July party at the Greenwich House. 40 people, catered, the kind of casual wealth that announces itself through what it chooses not to show off. I'd spent the week before the party finishing a pitch deck for what would become Meridian's largest acquisition to date, a distressed media group with assets in 6 cities. I was operating on 4 hours of sleep and running on the particular clarity that comes when you are doing the work you were made for. Margaret pulled me aside near the rose garden. She wanted to talk about Daniel's career. Specifically, she wanted to talk about how I was affecting it. She had heard, she said carefully, that Daniel had mentioned to a colleague that his wife worked from home, that she did contract work, that she was, and Margaret chose this word with surgical precision, finding her footing. People talk, Margaret said. And when people hear that Daniel Harlow married a woman who's still finding her footing at 31, it reflects on him, on all of us. I'm sure you understand. I understood. I understood that she had just told me I was an embarrassment, that my work, which I could not explain to her, which had already generated more revenue than her husband's firm would see in 5 years, was a source of shame to be managed rather than a life to be respected. I smiled. I said I would keep that in mind. I went back to the party and spent the rest of the evening making pleasant conversation, and that night I lay awake and felt the specific grief of being made invisible by people who believe their blindness is your deficiency. I didn't cry. I made a decision. I would wait. I would watch. I would give Daniel time to show me whether he was his own man or his mother's son, and I would be ready when the moment came for whatever the answer turned out to be. The moment was now. The answer was the tablecloth he had stared at instead of warning me. The device on the table, I said, keeping my voice even, is a recorder. It's been running since I sat down. Everything Margaret said about the post-nuptial agreement, everything about the forensic accountant, everything about marital fraud, it's on there. More importantly, it's already backed up. Encrypted, off-site. Margaret's composure fractured for just a moment, like a hairline crack in porcelain. She recovered quickly. That's inadmissible. You can't record a private conversation without consent. Connecticut is a one-party consent state, I said. I was present. That's all it takes. Gerald moved away from the door. Rachel, let's not be dramatic. We're family. Gerald, I said, I'd like to tell you something about the company that bought 4 of your distressed assets last winter. The room got very quiet. Meridian Capital, I said. David Chen was the representative you met with. He's a good attorney. Patient, good at keeping a straight face. I watched Gerald's expression move through confusion towards something darker. David works for me. Meridian is mine. Has been mine for 7 years. Nobody spoke. The Whitfield account that your forensic accountant found, it's clean. But here's what your forensic accountant missed, because they were only looking where you told them to look. I reached into my bag again and placed a single sheet of paper on the table. That's a summary of Meridian's current holdings. You'll see Harlow Group assets listed on page 2, along with the terms of the acquisition agreement your husband signed, specifically the clause that gives Meridian the right to accelerate repayment in the event of any legal action against Meridian's principals. Gerald picked up the paper. I watched the color leave his face, one shade at a time. I am a principal, I said. If you file a marital fraud claim against me, you trigger that clause. The Harlow Group would need to repay $63 million within 90 days. I let that number exist in the room for a moment. I checked your liquidity last week. You don't have it. Margaret stood up. This is insane. Daniel, she's lying. Daniel was looking at me the way you look at a landscape you thought you had memorized and are now seeing for the first time. Rachel, I'm not finished, I said. I turned to Margaret. I had been preparing for this part. Not with anger. I had moved through anger a long time ago, standing in a rose garden, being told I was an embarrassment, but with the clean, precise energy of someone who knows exactly where every piece is on the board. 3 years ago, I said, the Greenwich house was refinanced. You used the equity to cover the firm's operating losses. I know this because I bought the paper on that mortgage 18 months ago through a subsidiary. I own your mortgage, Margaret. I have owned it for 1.5 years, and I have not said a single word about it, because I was giving Daniel the chance to be different from you. She sat back down. I looked at my husband. He was the only one I still felt anything complicated about. The others. Gerald with his slow authority, Margaret with her surgical pleasantness. I had made peace with what they were. Daniel was different. I had loved him. Part of me still did, the way you can love something and also know with absolute certainty that you cannot stay inside it. I want you to understand something, I said to him. I wasn't hiding this to hurt you. I was waiting to see if you were safe enough to trust with it. Tonight told me what I needed to know. He opened his mouth. I shook my head. The door opened. Not the dining room door, the door to the hallway that led in from the side entrance, the one the catering staff used. David Chen stepped in, followed by 2 people I recognized and 2 I didn't. One of the unfamiliar ones was wearing a jacket with 3 letters on the back. Margaret made a sound that wasn't a word. I called David 2 hours ago, I said. When Daniel texted me that we were having dinner with his parents before the party, he knows my patterns well enough to know that wasn't social. I stood up and straightened my dress. The forensic accountant your family hired. His name is Frank Bauer. He has a history of providing litigation support in cases where the evidence has been shaped before it's delivered to an attorney. David has been aware of him for a while. Turns out 3 of Frank's previous cases are currently under federal review for fabricated financial documentation. Gerald moved toward David. This is private property, you have no... Gerald. David's voice was very calm. Please don't. One of the people I didn't recognize introduced herself to Gerald and began explaining, in the measured tone of someone who has done this many times, what was about to happen next. I stopped listening to the specifics. I had read the documents. I knew what the charges were. What mattered now was what was on the other side of this room. I picked up my bag. I walked to the door. Rachel. It was Daniel. He hadn't moved from his chair. He looked diminished in a way I hadn't expected, and I found that I didn't feel triumphant about it. I felt tired. Genuinely, thoroughly tired in the way that only comes after you have been performing normalcy for longer than any person should. I would have given you everything, I said. Not the money, I mean trust. Partnership. The actual thing. I looked at him for a long moment. You chose them. You've been choosing them for 6 years and calling it love. He didn't answer. There wasn't anything to say. I walked down the hallway. Behind me I could hear Margaret's voice, still trying to negotiate, still cycling through registers, injured, then outraged, then pleading, working through her repertoire of emotional leverage and finding none of it had purchase anymore. The sound faded as I moved through the kitchen and out the side door into the November air. The driveway was very bright. Floodlights, a federal vehicle, a catering van that the catering staff was standing next to in visible confusion. I stood on the stone steps and took a breath that went all the way down. David appeared beside me. Everything okay? Define okay. He almost smiled. The recording is solid. Between that and the Bauer documentation, they don't have a case. And the acceleration clause is airtight. I know. What do you want to do about the mortgage? I looked at the house. It was beautiful in the cold light, stone and ivy, and the warm glow of 30 oblivious party guests still drinking champagne inside. Margaret had chosen every detail of it. The window treatments, the rose garden, the specific shade of cream in the foyer. She had built her entire sense of herself around the idea that she belonged in a house like this and other people did not. Start the foreclosure process, I said. Standard timeline. No acceleration. I thought about it for another moment. Make sure they have somewhere to go first. David nodded and moved away. I stood on the steps alone. I want to tell you something. Because I think this is the part that doesn't make it into most stories about nights like this. I didn't feel powerful standing there. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was something quieter and stranger, a kind of spaciousness, like a room you've been locked in for years has finally had all its furniture removed. Empty in a way that isn't sad. Empty in the way that means there is now room for something real. The thing my mother-in-law never understood, the thing people like her are constitutionally unable to understand, is that the point was never the money. The money was a byproduct. A record of what happens when someone refuses to let other people's definitions of them become true. I spent 7 years building something in the dark, because the people in my life kept turning off the lights and calling it love, and I needed to know, I genuinely needed to know, whether I could be real without their permission. I could. That's the part worth keeping. In the weeks that followed, the Harlow Group situation resolved itself in the predictable ways. Gerald retained an attorney who called David twice and then stopped calling. The legal threat against me was quietly dropped, which it had to be, given what the federal review of Frank Bauer's work turned up. Margaret called Daniel's phone, which he had stopped answering, and then she called mine, which I answered once, out of something I can only describe as residual courtesy. You destroyed this family, she said. No. I said. You built something that couldn't survive honesty. That's not the same thing. I filed for divorce in December. Daniel didn't contest it. I think somewhere underneath everything, he was relieved. Relieved not to be in the middle of it anymore. Not to have to choose, not to have to be the man his mother needed him to be. I don't know. I stopped trying to understand his interiority a long time before I stopped living with him. What I kept was the apartment in the city that had always been mine before the marriage and had remained mine throughout it, on a lease held through a Meridian subsidiary, which meant it had never technically been a marital asset. I kept my work. I kept the specific early morning quiet of sitting at my desk with coffee going cold beside me and a problem I'm halfway to solving. I lost a marriage that had been, if I'm being precise about it, mostly a performance of a marriage. I lost access to a family that had never quite let me belong to it. I lost the version of myself that was still waiting for those people to see her clearly. I have not missed any of it. What I have instead is this. The knowledge, hard-earned and permanent, that I never needed their validation to be real. That the $900 million, the portfolio, the quiet empire built in the spaces they looked past, none of it would have mattered if I had given it all away trying to make them love me. The power was never in the money. It was in the decision, made a long time ago in a 2-bedroom apartment in Akron by a woman with $4,000 and an idea to take herself seriously before anyone else did. I took a car home from Greenwich that night. The highway was empty and the sky was very dark, and I sat in the back seat and let myself be quietly, privately grateful, not for what I had done to them, but for what I had found out about myself in the doing of it. I thought about my mother, working night shifts so I could have lunch money and school supplies and the occasionally dignity of a new coat in winter. I thought about the specific quality of her tiredness, which was never self-pity, which was always just the next thing and the thing after that. She died before Beridian was worth anything real. She never knew. I have thought about this more times than I can count. Whether it would have changed something to have been able to show her, to have been able to say, "Look, it worked, your investment paid out," and I have come to believe that she already knew, not the details. The thing underneath the details. Mothers like that always do. I didn't lose a family that night in Greenwich. I finally stopped auditing myself against one.